Our next slide here is on the meninges. The meninges are very important to protect the brain. There is an outer dura mater, a middle arachnoid mater, and an inner pia mater. We can see the dura mater in the diagram, arachnoid mater and pia mater. So the brain is protected by these meninges, as well as cerebrospinal fluid. The cerebrospinal fluid is super important because it permits the brain to not collapse on itself. So the harmful substances are shielded from the brain by the blood-brain barrier. The dura mater, also kind of called tough mother, which is kind of interesting, is tough, leathery, strong meninges. The arachnoid, the middle layer, is a middle meninge that forms a loose brain covering. The subarachnoid space is filled with cerebrospinal fluid and large blood vessels. And the arachnoid villi protrude superiorly and permit CSF to be absorbed back into the venous blood. And then finally, the pia mater, it's kind of like shrink wrap on the brain. It's very clear. It's a delicate connective tissue that clings tightly to the brain. Cerebrospinal fluid is a very important liquid cushion of constant volume around the brain. Remember, it's produced by these ependymal cells of the choroid plexus, which you can see in the lower right-hand corner of this image. Remember, there's two choroid plexuses, one in the third ventricle and one near the fourth ventricle between the pons and the cerebellum. The CSF is formed as a filtrate containing glucose, oxygen, vitamins, and important ions. So it's slightly different than plasma, but very, very important. Some of its functions are that it forms a liquid cushion that gives buoyancy to the CNS organs, both the brain as well as the spinal cord, and it prevents the brain from crushing under its own weight and protects from blows as well as other trauma. So CSF production is about 500 milliliters per day, and the turnover of that CSF is 8 hours. So CSF is the filtrate like blood plasma, but less protein, different ion amounts that nourish the brain. So let's look at CSF circulation in this diagram here. We have the choroid plexus of each ventricle producing the CSF. So the CSF of the fourth ventricle, and also a choroid plexus around the third ventricle. The CSF flows through the ventricles and into the subarachnoid space. After that, the CSF flows through the subarachnoid space and is eventually absorbed into the dural venous sinuses via the arachnoid granulation. So the dural venous sinuses are close to the dura, sorry. So around this area, this would be a dural sinus that we see right here. And a sinus is a large kind of flattened blood vessel that's going to receive usually deoxygenated blood. And you're going to learn about that next semester when you learn about what's called the coronary sinus in the posterior side of the heart. The blood-brain barrier is part of this, and it's in the meninges. It's a protective mechanism that helps maintain a stable environment for the brain. It allows specific nutrients, so it's very selective, like glucose, amino acids, and ions to pass freely. Because of the nature of it, since it is a membrane, remember anything that has a similar it's a similar molecule can pass through, can diffuse through a plasma membrane. So this would include things like nicotine, alcohol, or anesthetics. So we can look here at most capillaries, which you'll learn about next semester. Most capillaries are going to have endothelial cells. You learned about that as a type of epithelium earlier in the semester. They have small gaps called intercellular clefts between endothelial cells that allow mixing between blood plasma and interstitial fluid. However, in the brain capillaries, what we see are also endothelial cells, but we have tight junctions between those endothelial cells, and they're key structures of the brain, the blood-brain barrier, and they exclude molecules except those that are lipid soluble from the brain. The other important structure is the astrocytes. Remember, they're a type of glial cell that you learned about, and they induce formation of these tight junctions and sort of anchor these capillaries within the central nervous system. One of the important factors of the blood-brain barrier is that it's absent in vomiting centers and the hypothalamus, because those areas need to quickly respond. For traumatic brain injuries and chronic traumatic encephalopathy, which is CTE, you've all heard a lot about CTE lately in the news, especially with football players. When we talk about a traumatic brain injury, there's various levels. We have a concussion, which is alteration in brain function, followed by a blow to a head. So after there's a blow to a head to a football player, they usually go into the tent to be looked at. There's a protocol for concussions. If it's a concussion leading to bruising of the brain or permanent damage, it's called a contusion. If there's swelling of the brain, that's called a cerebral edema. So here we see moderate and severe traumatic brain injuries. These are all physical problems that could occur, cognitive issues, or emotional issues. So there could be a lot of things that potentially happen from traumatic brain injuries. On the right side of this slide, we have CTE, which is chronic traumatic encephalopathy. A lot has been discovered by looking at autopsies of these brains after the person has died. So it's a progressive neurodegeneration due to repeated head trauma, memory impairment. The person could have concentration loss, poor judgment and impulse control, apathy, irritability, and hopelessness, as well as aggression or depression and suicide. So when we look at a CTE brain, which would be after death, we have a normal brain here, and you can see the most significant part are the lateral ventricles. The lateral ventricles would be these structures right here. They should not be that big, and that's the most significant difference in a CTE brain. This is a very extreme example, but you can see how large those lateral ventricles are. So those are the lateral ventricles. And then the other big difference is that there is a large division between the two hemispheres. So this is supposed to be the longitudinal fissure. So there's a lot of players that this has happened to. There was a great linebacker for the San Diego Chargers that I believe committed suicide, and it's suspected that it was CTE. So I wanted to include something that was kind of prevalent along with the traumatic brain injuries.